Does the Xbox Series X overheat? Over the last few weeks of having this console here in the office, that has been my #1 question that I've received, so why don't we take a closer look? So my setup involves a thermal camera, we also have a decibel meter as well as a microphone on the console, and I want to just find out exactly how loud it gets and how hot it gets. So I will give a disclaimer, while the embargo has now lifted and I can talk about all of this kind of hardware stuff, as well as a few other things that we'll talk about in a minute, this is not final Xbox Series X hardware. This is not a retail unit, this is a prototype. So technically we may see some slight differences between this and that final retail model, but at the very least it should give us a very good sense for what kind of performance the Xbox Series X has or doesn't have. So now that the Series X is on, it's going to start warming up, but essentially what you should see is all of that heat being exhausted out the top. So right now I am playing Gears 5, so this has been Series X optimized. So we might play some like Xbox One and 360 games later, but realistically I don't think that's going to tax the console in the same way that a game that is fully taking advantage of this hardware. So I've been playing for a little over 5 minutes now, and the Series X has gotten warmer, but not by a huge amount. The exhaust is sitting at somewhere around 45 degrees Celsius, and the fan noise, at least from where I'm sitting, is pretty much non-existent. But I'll be quiet and let you see the decibel meter and actually hear exactly how loud it is at the moment. So I think it's clear to say that the Series X is not going to overheat in a normal circumstance, right? I think that is pretty obvious. But what I really want to see is what happens when we start to compromise that by putting it on its side, or specifically by enclosing it in a box. Well, normally you would put it in like a cabinet or something, but we're just gonna put it in a box and see what happens. So next up, I want to put the Xbox Series X on its side. Now, I'm pretty confident that this will make next to no difference because while, yes, heat rises, generally speaking, I think all that heat is being pushed out the side. And regardless, this thing has feet on the side of it, so it's meant to be used in this orientation. But let's play a little while with the Xbox Series X on its side and see what happens. So satisfying. Everything with this is so satisfying.
Left side, the temperatures have not changed at all.
It hasn't changed at all?
51.
I'm not massively surprised. Like, it shouldn't really get that much warmer. So, if you were concerned at all about the Series X being on its side and overheating, don't. But I think where you may have a little bit more concern is you have it in an enclosed space. Because right now the Series X is wide open, it can get all the cool air it wants. But generally speaking, you're probably gonna have this in something like a TV cabinet. So to simulate a TV cabinet, we're putting it in a box. It's okay, we'll open one side of it. So what's our baseline right now?
52.
53, okay, so we're starting at 53, so a little warmer, for sure. After about 5 minutes or so of the Series X in the box, the temperatures aren't too crazy, but what I can hear is a lot more noise. So if I'm quiet for a second, you can hear where it's at. I wouldn't say it's particularly loud, and it's still not as loud as the PC that is sitting over to my right-hand side, but now we're getting a little bit closer to that 45 decibels, 46 or so on the meter. Now, temperature-wise, what are we at right now?
Oh, temperature is 56.
56. So 56 degrees Celsius, that seems to be roughly the point at which the Series X starts to ramp up that fan. I would say that if this was underneath my TV and I'm sitting any more than a couple feet away, I'm probably not going to really notice it. But you do start to hear it in a way that you haven't before, which does go to show that the ability for the Series X to get access to cool air makes a big difference. I will just say anecdotally, while you can obviously see the temperature, if I put my hand near it, it's toasty. Like, it's definitely kicking out some real heat. I think so far, it's okay. I'm not super worried. But what if we take this one step farther? So look, we've all been there, right? You're just playing your Xbox, no big deal, and your little brother comes by and tosses a PlayStation game right on top. Normally that would be a problem if you were using, say, an Xbox One, but because this is really the exhaust of the console, it's gonna mean that all of that hot air that is coming out of the Xbox has only one outlet. This little tiny port right here, which I can already tell feels very warm. So why don't we play for a few minutes and see what happens? Okay, that was cool. Okay, so in the time it took to clear this stage, what do we have going on over here? So it looks like we're sitting at about 54 degrees, so it's certainly not sort of choking. Whoa, you can feel the heat coming off of that though. I mean, all of that exhaust because we're pretty much entirely covered up, all of that heat is starting to kind of leak out here. Because I guess technically the game doesn't fully cover it. That being said, it is still not dying. I'm not losing any performance. The temperatures are, well, quite warm, not totally a disaster. And that fan noise, if this is as loud as it gets, I mean, you hear it. It's still quieter than the PC that's sitting right here that has 20 more fans in it. I've got to say, I'm impressed. I actually thought that this would be a much more difficult challenge because you got to consider that this Series X is pulling some serious power. But there's a whole lot more to the Series X than just that pure temperature. Why, hello there, and welcome to Austin's Xbox Series X testing dungeon. So I have a few games that I can play right now, and I can give you guys a little interface walkthrough. So the first thing I want to do is Dirt 5. So right now, just so you're aware, I'm recording this gameplay at 4K at 60 frames per second. However, the Series X is capable of going up to 4K 120, and Dirt 5 is one of the few games, at least so far, that does support that resolution. The downside though is that if I go into my video options, right now it's on image quality, I can switch it over to frame rate, but that does not unlock 120 because I don't have a 120 sort of setup. And I wish that there was some way on YouTube for me to actually show that properly. Instead, you'll have to kind of look at the 60 FPS gameplay and imagine. So the thing with Dirt 5 is that this is a game which will also be launching on last-gen consoles as well as PC. However, this version has been optimized for the Xbox Series X. So as you can see, the graphics are impressive on Dirt. Now again, this is not a completely native game, so because it is sharing some components with the Xbox One version and the PC version, I assume that later games in the cycle will be able to take better advantage of the hardware. But that being said, it does look good. Now, there are a couple of small technical issues in the build that I am playing right now, but this is very early beta stuff. The hardware isn't finished, software is not finished, game's not finished, you know, the standard sort of stuff. What is good enough is for at least a little bit of a look at how well the Series X will perform. So one of the things that I think is also worth talking about is the latency, or rather the lack thereof. So there are a few optimizations with the Xbox Series X to improve latency. So one of which is the controller is able to timestamp and send those frames to the Xbox Series X to better sync things up. Supposedly that helps out a little bit. So one thing to definitely keep in mind with this generation is that while some games will look better no matter what, to get the best advantage of it, you are gonna need a good setup around it. So that means something like a TV which can support 120 FPS, something that will support ideally auto low latency mode, so you have things like FreeSync or variable refresh rate. And that's not something that most people have right now. This is early in the console generation, right? You can imagine that as time goes on, there are already TVs which are starting to come down in price that will support a lot of these features. But importantly, as that becomes more and more mainstream, you'll be able to get better and better performance out of the hardware that you already have with the console. And come on, really? 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 Ah! I was so close. I was so close. You know what, why don't I actually give you a little preview of the interface. So things look very similar to on the Xbox One, which shouldn't be a surprise because the Xbox Series X in a lot of ways is an evolution of the Xbox One. So when you first get your Xbox Series X or Series S, one of the very first things you should do is jump into the settings and tune it for your display. So it's in general and the TV and display options. So there are a few things you should do. So if you open up the 4K TV details, you'll see that right now it says that I can't do a lot. That's purely because I'm recording. If I had this directly plugged into my TV, a lot of the stuff would light up. But what you can do is you can first of all pick your resolution. So if you have the option of a higher refresh rate display, you will also be able to pick that up from 60 to 120. Right now it's grayed out because I can't do that. And you also have your video modes. So a lot of the stuff will be automatically turned on by default, but if you can enable stuff like auto low latency mode, which will allow the Xbox and TV to communicate so that it will automatically pick the best settings for you to get into game mode, as well as stuff like variable refresh rate, which is essentially FreeSync, will allow the TV to refresh at the same time as the Xbox, therefore giving you a smoother experience with fewer dropped frames, and specifically fewer torn frames. So something else I think is worth talking about with the Xbox Series X is the storage. So if I hop into my system and take a look at my storage, you'll see that right now I have 800 gigs free right out of the box. So I filled up about half of that with the various different games that I've been playing with. But you also have the storage expansion module.
Now, of course, this is an optional accessory for the Series S or the Series X, and what it does is it gives you the same performance of that internal SSD, and that is important because if you plan on installing Xbox Series S and Series X games to your console, you will need to install it onto one of these two devices, either your internal SSD or the expansion module. Now, you can still connect a USB hard drive, however, that will be limited to copying files back and forth and specifically running older games. So you can run an Xbox One game or a 360 or an original Xbox game off of a USB hard drive, but if you want to play a optimized Series X or Series S game, you will need to install it into one of these two locations. Now, I will say that the 1TB expansion card does drop down to 920 gigs when you actually have it hooked up, and the actual storage on the Series X is also significantly below 1TB, but obviously you have things like the formatting, you have the operating system, and you also have a buffer for games to essentially hibernate, so that's what the quick resume is all about. One example of the speed of these next-gen consoles is just simply in loading times. So I've showed a little bit in the backwards compatibility, but with Dirt 5, a game which is completely optimized for the Series X, let me show you just how quick it is to jump into a game. So unlike something like the Xbox One or the PS4, which could take 30 seconds, 45 seconds, a minute or more based on which game you're playing, because we have that CPU as well as the SSD, this feels very much like a high-end PC when it comes to loading games. So it's one of those things that, like, once you get used to it, it doesn't seem like a big deal. But as soon as you step back down to an older console, you're like, oh my god, what was I thinking?
So what have we learned today? Well, to put the title in context, the Xbox Series X doesn't seem to have any major overheating issue. It does a good job in any normal circumstance, and of course, as dust and time attacks it, we'll have to wait and see, but so far so good. On a lot of the other fronts, it's also looking promising. So while the UI might not be a huge step forward, there's still a lot of new stuff that we're going to be waiting on over the next few months as more games come out and as we get a more fine look at the final version of the Series X. So make sure to subscribe, check out some of our other Xbox and PlayStation videos. Until next time, I will catch you whenever we decide to move on to the video where I'm right in front of the camera and very uncomfortably close.